Welcome to episode 17 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who lived in the age of Julius Caesar and wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Before we start with today's episode, let me remind you of our 3 ground rules. First, our aim is to go back to the original text to bring you an accurate presentation of classical Epicurean philosophy as the ancient Epicureans understood it, not simply to repeat to you what modern commentators teach about it today. Second, we won't be talking about modern political issues in this podcast. Epicurean philosophy is very different from Stoicism, humanism, Buddhism, Taoism, atheism, and Marxism, and it must be understood on its own, not in terms of any conventional modern morality. Third, the physics presented by Lucretius is the essential base of Epicurean philosophy. When you study this, you'll see that Epicurus taught neither luxury nor minimalism, but that feeling, pleasure, and pain are the guides that nature gave us to live by, not supernatural gods, not idealism, and not virtue ethics. More than anything else, Epicurus taught that there is nothing supernatural whatsoever, and that means there's no life after death, and any happiness we will ever have must come in this life, which is why it's so important not to waste time in confusion. Remember that our homepage is lucretiustoday.com, and there you can find a free copy of the versions of the poem we're reading. In episode 17, we'll discuss how all things are not made of a single element, such as fire, contrary to what some philosophers of the time asserted, such as Heraclitus, who held that all things are made of fire. Now let's join the discussion with Elaine reading today's text.
Lastly, if nature, parent of things, had not compelled all things that perish then to be resolved into least parts, she could from them repair nothing that dies, for bodies that are formed of various parts can never be endued with properties which the first seeds of things ought to possess, as union, weight, and force, agreement, motion, by which all things act. And yet, suppose nature had allowed no end to bodies being divided, yet some bodies from eternity must have been, which by no force could ever be subdued, but bodies that are formed of brittle seeds and to be broken could not have remained for ages infinite, vexed as they have been with endless blows, but must have been dissolved. Wherefore those sages who have thought that fire is the first principle of things, and from that alone the whole is formed, do greatly err from the true rule of reason. The champion of these, Heraclitus, enters first the list, more famed for dark expression among empty Greeks than with the wise, who search for truth, for none but fools admire and love what they see couched in words abstruse, and that they take for truth which quaintly moves the ear and painted over effects by witty jingling of the sound. For how such various beings could arise, I ask, if formed from pure and real fire? To say that the hot fire is now condensed and sometimes rarefied would not avail. The several parts must still retain the nature of fire, the same which the fire had when whole. The heat would be more fierce, the parts condensed, more languid when divided and made rare. There is nothing more than this you can derive from causes such as these. Much less so, great variety of things can be produced from fire or flame, condensed or made rare. Indeed, would they admit in things a void, fire might then be condensed or rarefied, but this, because it contradicts their other schemes, they murmur at, and will allow in things no empty space. So while they fear to grant this difficult truth, they lose the way that's right, nor do they see, by not allowing there isn't things a void, all bodies would be dense, and out of all one only would be made, which could by force emit nothing without itself, as the hot fire emits both light and heat, which shows it is not composed of crowded parts without a void.
But if they think that a fire in all its parts may be extinguished, and so its body change, if they insist that this may once be done, then the whole fire must be resolved to nothing, and things new formed from nothing must arise. For whatsoever is changed and breaks the bounds of its first nature dies, and is no more what must still remain whole and unhurt, lest things to nothing should perfectly return, and then revive, and should again from nothing be restored. But now, since there remain some certain seeds that keep their nature still the same, whose absence or their presence and their change of order change the nature of compound bodies, you must not think that these first things are fiery. If they were, what would it signify what seeds are absent, or what retire, what others take their place, how others may their rank and order change, since all would still be in their nature fire, and beings formed from them must wholly be of fire. But as I think the case is thus, some certain seeds there are, by whose concussion, motion, order, sight, and figure, fire is formed. And when their order is changed, they change the nature of this fire. But these first seeds have nothing fiery in themselves, nor of such a nature are they as to send forth bodies to be perceived by sense, or be the object of our touch. And now to say that everything is fire, and no true thing in nature does exist but fire, as this man does, is madness all. He contradicts his senses by his sense, and overthrows those tests of truth by which all things are known. For 'tis by them we know what thing which he calls fire. And this sense concludes it truly knows the nature of this fire. But then all other things it will deny, which are equally true. This is to me a vain and foolish way to judge. For to what shall we apply? And what can be more sure than our senses to us, by which we fully know falsehood and truth? Besides, why anyone should all things else disclaim, and only fire allow, or say there's no such thing as fire, and all things else allow? Either of this is in vain, and equal madness to believe. Wherefore those sages who contend that fire is the first principle, and that of fire all things consist, and those who make the air the first seeds of bodies, and such who lay the water is the sole cause of beings, or that the earth all thing creates, and can infuse itself into the nature of things, do strangely err and wander wide from the truth.
I love that phrase, wander wide from the truth.
I was about to mention how this whole thing also applies to Thales of Miletus, but then he mentioned that in the last paragraph with water.
Okay.
What are the four
Say more about that.
Yeah, the four classical elements, Charles, what? Earth, air, fire, water?
Yes.
Yeah. I believe Thales is counted among one of the 7 sages of Greece. I know Heraclitus was. This would be pre-Socratic as well.
Well, and I think reading this whole section, keeping in mind where he's showing how certain current thinkers were wandering wide from the truth, is good, because that's what this is, an argument against specific ideas that were around in that time and that still are, I guess. Remind me, as we get to the end of this, I want to mention some similar things that are going on now.
I agree with what you're saying, that there's lots to draw from this whole section. You know, one of the things that we are often asked about is Epicurean philosophy being dogmatic, and just what is truth, and do we take positions that some things are actually right and wrong, and what do right and wrong mean? Well, one thing you can certainly derive from this whole section here is that Epicurus is taking the position that Heraclitus is wrong in maintaining that everything is made of fire. That doesn't necessarily mean that Epicurus is going to be dogmatic about everything he says in every subject, but there are certain things he's certainly taking a position that some things are right and some things are wrong. But that's more of a conclusion than it is talking about the text itself.
Let's go back to the beginning. So this first verse is taking where we left off about that there was a limit to the divisibility of things, that you couldn't just infinitely go on dividing down particles. There was a limit to that. And so this goes on from there to say that if things, when they perish, if they weren't resolved into their least parts, if there were no least parts for them to resolve into, there wouldn't be anything to repair. There wouldn't be anything to make anything new out of, because there wouldn't be any available particles. That's how I understand that as the meaning there. Would you say?
Yeah, I think he's just, again, emphasizing over and over and over again that the regularity of the universe comes from a particular source that is natural and is not supernatural, and that source, which can be counted on to be the continuity forever, is the nature of the elemental particles.
But also this is appealing to just our ordinary practical observations of things, that, where would you get the material to repair anything from if you didn't have available particles released from other things dissolving?
Right. He's not just making the statement, remember there are elemental particles. He's making the statement, observe the way the world works, and you will remember that there must be elemental particles.
Right. That we're making our conclusions based on observations and not just, this seems like it ought to be.
He doesn't say, take
my word for it.
So in this last paragraph, Lucretius is referring specifically towards Heraclitus with fire, Thales and Miletus with water, Anaximander, the earth, and then Anaximenes of Miletus for air. And it's clearly to call out pre-Socratic materialistic monism with the belief that these common elements were comprised of everything. But like it was mentioned, this can't be the case, because you can observe those four classical elements with your senses, and they have distinct properties. And if everything was made up of those, they would have to have those properties.
Right.
Like he says with fire.
Thank you, Charles, for looking that up. I think that adds a lot to this, because one thing that's always important to remember is that there were specific reasons why these particular arguments were made, and there are additional arguments we might make today, which I will make when we get done with this. So you have to know what your readers are up against.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's super helpful.
And it's clear, it gives some background on what exactly Lucretius is talking about.
Yeah.
Who he's refuting.
Right.
And that's another general category of discussions that we frequently run into as well. How much do we wish to discuss what other people are saying? And when you've got a background of everybody being taught something that appears to be wrong, you've got to discuss what other people are saying, especially if you think that they're wrong. If you think that what they're saying out there is wrong is the foundation of the way people are making their errors, then you have to call that out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother discussion, like how much time do you spend doing that? You don't want to let them drive your agenda.
Right.
As much as it's needed to get to your point.
Well, that's right, Charles. There's not a specific rule like that can ever supersede your goal of pleasure, so it's going to depend on the circumstances. Real good point.
This isn't based on any actual record, but I'm sure Epicurus talked about Democritean atoms in his book on nature before explaining his idea, or why he thinks they're this way.
Yeah.
That position that you take on elements of nature is very, very close to your position on where these elements come from. And so many of these other people are ultimately saying they were created by God. And that's very close to a foundational problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so back to start with 627. This is more about if there was no end to being divided, you could never get to a final point where you had your elemental particles, what he called the atoms. If that were possible, but there were some of those particles that have existed from eternity. Help me through this. Where is he going with this?
Well, one place he's going, Elaine, is pointing out that if everything dissolves to nothing, then eventually there will be nothing left. And what's not stated there, but which is the presumption is is that there's nothing new coming into existence from nothing. There's no gods or any other source that's creating anything new from nothing to replace those things that have gone to nothing. So you do have both principles at work. Nothing comes from nothing and nothing goes to nothing. But the nothing comes from nothing is the one he started with.
Yeah, I guess I was talking more about the specific wording here in the Daniel Brown on 627, but I don't see 627 listed in these other translations. Let me go to Martin Ferguson Smith and see. This is more clear. Let me just read this little section of Martin Ferguson Smith, because I think that's what he meant, but the wording there is real difficult for, I guess, a modern ear. So lastly, if it had been creative nature's way to compel all things to be resolved into their smallest parts, she would no longer be able to renew anything out of them, because objects that are insufficiently bulky to have any parts cannot possess the essential characteristics of generative matter, namely the variety of interlacements, weights, collisions, concurrences, and movements that cause all things to happen. That's just a more clear translation to me.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure our listeners are not, and I get the general idea, but I don't know exactly what he's saying. I want them to know exactly. And then we get to fire.
I was thinking about this, and I intended to look it up, and I did not do it. I don't know whether we have a link here between the Stoic view of divine fire and that they trace that back to Heraclitus, or whether it's different or not. Certainly the Stoics talk about divine fire a lot, and Heraclitus was saying everything is made of fire. I presume there's probably a link, but I just don't know.
I think not. I think this Stoic divine fire is more something symbolic. I don't think that they take it as an element.
Oh, okay.
So what immediately attracts my attention in this section is this love what they see couched in words of truth, and that they take for truth which quaintly moves the ear. So I want to read again the Martin Ferguson Smith here, because I think it really brings that home. For fools always have a greater admiration and liking for any idea that they see obscured in a mist of paradoxical language, and adopt as true what succeeds in prettily tickling their ears and is painted with a specious sound. So I'm going to be careful here, because I have friends that I care about who are not Epicureans who enjoy the paradoxical. And so, if they get pleasure from that funny feeling that you get when two things can't possibly both be true, that's a property of language, that's not a property of nature. Nature is not ever paradoxical. And I understand what they're saying. It's kind of a funny feeling you get. It's like, what? How can that be? And I can understand why it's enjoyable. So I'm not going to call them fools for having pleasure in anything. What you have pleasure in is what you have pleasure in. It's a problem if you take it to be somehow more true than what you can observe.
I have a colleague. I don't know what actual philosophy is. He's very influenced by Alan Watts.
Yes, right.
And I know I've mentioned Alan Watts before, but my interest or my research into him has been sparked by this friend of mine. But he derives truth from paradox.
Yes. Yeah.
He claims he does.
It's that certain feeling that you have, and I think everybody probably knows what I'm talking about. I've called it the brain pretzel feeling. It's just, there's just something impossible about, what you're thinking. They take that as a signal that they have encountered a truth.
Or achieved it.
Yeah. So just because of personal relationships, I would not use the language fool, because I don't want to hurt my friend's feelings, but I think it's a mistake. I think it's an error. It's not, because nature doesn't have paradoxes. It's a language thing. And so if you enjoy the paradoxes of language, I don't see any problem in that. That can be fun, but just don't get that confused with what's accurate. It's two different things.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of like the Pyrrhonist suspension of belief.
Can you say more about that?
It's a part of the whole skeptic thing. And this relates to dogmatism, or sort of like a rejection of dogmatism, like a third, like very strong rejection, almost to the point where nothing can be known.
Right.
But it just ties into that, if these things are paradoxical, then we can't know it for certain.
Right.
And they sort of have this state where they only know that things are contradictory.
So I almost feel like the skeptics, though, they're more certain in their uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have kind of a little paradox there.
And so
They're
that's what they feel
Yeah.
as true.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Which, as people point out, I remember DeWitt pointing this out, the response to that, and Lucretius points that out, the response to the statement that nothing can be known is, well, then your statement cannot be known. You're asserting something that you have no grounds for asserting, and so you're asserting that your statement itself is unproven and unknowable.
So a good paradoxicalist would say, exactly. Mm-hmm. Now you've got it.
I talked about that with a coworker, and he said that was a product of wordplay.
It is.
It is wordplay.
Absolutely. And so I don't object to the fun of wordplay. I may be diverging a little bit from Lucretius and Epicurus and that. But you got to know what you're doing. You got to be careful.
Elaine, also in what I was saying, when I referred to DeWitt a minute ago, if I remember correctly, when DeWitt brings this up, DeWitt makes the point that pointing out the inconsistency in the assertion is not really a proof that the assertion is wrong. The person who says that nothing can be known is implicitly saying that his statement is correct, which is an inconsistency. But ultimately, just pointing out that he's being inconsistent doesn't necessarily give you the sense of confidence or certainty that you need to know that he's wrong.
True.
So you've got to ultimately go beyond and over this wordplay, and where I'm going with that is you go beyond the wordplay and back to your position on what is the source of truth, and the source of truth is the senses.
Okay, and so let's keep going with that, because there is an element of usefulness in their recognition that language ultimately leads to paradox, because language is expressing always, it's using symbolism, it's using concepts. The word never has everything in it that the object you're talking about or the feeling has. It represents, it's to communicate, but it is abstraction inevitably, and that's why you have words, you can infinitely deconstruct them and it looks like everything falls apart, and that's because the concepts themselves are not a replacement for reality. And so if you follow it all the way through and you realize that these paradoxes mean there's something wrong, there's something fundamentally missing in the ability of abstract concepts to replace reality, then you're on the right track, because the truth is not in an abstraction. It's not in a concept. It's just reality is reality. And if people will take it all the way to that and just say, well, it's the limitation of languages, we try to tie it to a perceived reality, to our senses as much as possible, and admit that concepts the map is not the territory, then that to me is okay.
Does anybody want to disagree with anything Elaine just said? Because I agree with what she just said, and I think it's very well stated, and I think that's very fundamental to what we're doing.
Good, because I've wondered if I would be clear about that. It's something I've been thinking about a lot because of my friends that enjoy that paradox.
Well, this issue of reductionism is recurring because it probably has a direct parallel that this is why Epicurus rejected infinite indivisibility, that if you take reductionism so far, you end up with absolute nothingness. And
right.
We don't have absolute nothingness, so we just can't accept absolute nothingness as the end result of the analysis.
Yes. Yeah.
In concepts or in physics or in ethics.
Well, in concepts, you have that problem. That's one of the problems with concepts.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, in observed nature, you don't have that problem.
If infinite reduction were the case, then you would, in Epicurean analysis, have resulted over eternity in nothingness of the universe. There'd be nothing
right.
left.
Nothing, yes.
But we see that things do exist.
Yes, yes.
So there's something wrong with the infinite reduction theory.
Yes.
I really just think this passage is one of the most memorable ones in the whole book. So
Yes.
I was going to include the Monroe and the Bailey versions as well because there's variations of them, but I think they're all well stated.
Okay, great.
And I'll say it because I know where you're coming from, Elaine, that we're not trying to insult anybody, but this is really an example of the aggressiveness or just the strength or whatever of Epicurean doctrine. He is putting it on the line here, and he's being very clear. And Heraclitus would be somebody who was well known and well respected and considered to be a great philosopher. And yet this is the Monroe version. At the head of whom enters Heraclitus to do battle, famous for obscurity, more among the frivolous than the earnest Greeks who seek the truth. For fools admire and like all things the more which they perceive to be concealed under involved language, and determine things to be true which can prettily tickle the ears and are varnished over with finely sounding phrase. And I think the varnish is a good word that Monroe uses there. So I won't read the whole thing that Bailey says, but Bailey says, for fools loud and love all things more which they can descry beneath hidden twisted sayings, and they set up for true what can tickle the ear with a pretty sound and is tricked out with a smart ring. The tricked out with a smart ring has a kind of a modern ring to it as well. But
yes. Okay, so let me read, since we're doing that, let me read Stallings. Yeah. For idiots admire things all the more.
Idiots?
Yes. Whoa. For idiots admire things all the more when they discern them hidden in tangled words and set great store in anything that tickles the ear in phrases dyed a shade of purple. That's the poet.
That puts it on the line.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say these days, not that I object to strong wording. You know me, I'm going to call it, but it depends on how much I care about the other person.
Depends on who you're talking to. Right.
It depends on who I'm talking to. I prefer for them say, you're kind of on the right track. You just haven't gone far enough. You haven't realized that language and the concepts are not the same as reality.
Elaine, following on to what you're saying, at least in my life, some of the people who are the closest and most important to me and who I am concerned about the most are also some of the people who have some of the, in my view, wrong beliefs about the nature of the world and the nature of religion and so forth. And so if you know the people who are involved, you have a much more natural sense of wanting to be compassionate and being understanding with them. And you're not trying to hurt them by calling them fools or idiots.
Right.
And so you have to be careful with the way you express things.
And again, the pleasure that they're feeling in this sensation of language paradox is pleasure. And we have to always be careful not to say that any pleasure is not pleasure because it's subjective. And if the person is enjoying it, it's pleasure. But what we have to come back to is this a dangerous pleasure? Because whenever you're covering over some aspect of reality and not looking at it, it puts you at risk of making inaccurate decisions for your life that will not lead you to pleasure. So it puts you at risk of more pain than pleasure. And you can have pleasure accidentally or by doing things that will lead to more pain. It's real pleasure, but it could hurt you, in the big picture of your life. And that's why we're saying these things.
Somebody looking for an example of that can find it right in the letter to Menicius, where Epicurus says it would be better to believe the myths about the gods than to believe what essentially means hard determinism, because at least if you're in the middle of a religion where you think that you can make the gods happy and they can make you happy, then you're still at least have some means of controlling your pleasure and your happiness. But if you believe in hard determinism, then you're barred from that.
Oh, yeah, right. That does belong.
But without getting into a discussion of determinism and free will again, the point being is that you can derive pleasure from things that ultimately may be harmful to you.
Right.
So I'm just agreeing with Elaine's basic point that if you're experiencing pleasure, you're experiencing pleasure. The feeling is the feeling. It's just a matter of how you're doing it and whether the consequences of the means you choose are going to ultimately lead to more pleasure or lead to pain.
And there are some people who can believe these wrong things and enjoy their whole lives. It's just like you can lay down on the highway and not get hit by a truck, but that doesn't make it a wise decision for the average person. So, a person making a choice on their philosophy can look around and say, well, I see these happy people that are believing these things that are obviously not true. Well, we can't deny that, but then what are your odds if you're not looking at reality? What are your odds for making accurate decisions for your happiness, for your pleasure?
And that would be relatable to principle doctrine number 10, which says that if you could be a despicable person and still experience a life of pleasure, then we'd have no reason to complain about that, because the resulting pleasure is the standard by which you judge whether something's been successful or not.
Right.
It's just that there are certain choices in life, such as lying in the middle of the highway, which are not very well calculated to lead to a long-term pleasure.
Yes.
Okay, where are we?
In 646, where he's going on more about fire. How could you get any kind of variety if fire was your only starting point? So because for him, the elemental particles were not all the same particle. So if you were just starting from fire, everything would have the nature of fire. You couldn't have other things. And he says there's nothing more than this you can derive from causes such as these. You couldn't have the variety of things you have. And I think that is, in modern physics, there's not just a single elemental particle. There's more than one type of thing. Am I correct on that, Martin?
Yes.
Yeah. So he's got that down. That makes sense. And this is something a person reading this can just look around and see. Obviously, everything is not made of fire. We're not all on fire. We have different properties.
Elaine, do you want to continue through the next couple of passages there? Because I'm not sure if I know you had some points you wanted to make at the end, and I don't want to go too long today.
Well, this is more about this, you can't just have one thing. So this is an important argument. Apparently the fire people were not agreeing that there could be any void, any space, so that you could condense or rarefy, spread out, diffuse the fire. But they're saying, no, you don't have a void. That contradicts their scheme that you can make everything out of fire. So it's not just that they're incorrect in failing to observe nature. Their idea is also internally self-contradictory. You can't be right because it doesn't go together. And then the same thing in this next section.
See if there's anything you want to comment on that passage or the one that's labeled 676, because I do think that when we get to the one that's labeled 691, we've got to spend a few minutes on talking about the one.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's important to read because all of these are arguments on the obviousness of the impossibility of what they're saying about things being made of fire. And I don't think we necessarily need to belabor that. I think it's important that people heard that when you read that part.
Right.
Or that they reread it, but these are quite obvious that it's impossible that everything was made of fire.
I would want to add on to what Elaine was saying about 646. In the letter to Herodotus, Epicurus does say that these atoms do have different properties.
Yeah.
Because if not, then the same exact logic would apply.
You can't just have one elemental particle. Okay, so people that think that everything is made out of God, out of some kind of God particle, it's the same problem you run into. It's not just one thing. So, but really, so starting with 691, and now to say that everything is fire and no true thing in nature does exist but fire, as this man does, is madness all. He contradicts his senses by his sense. Let's look at the other translations of that.
And overthrows those tests of truth by which all things are known. That phrase is the one I wanted to emphasize. But yes, go ahead with the other.
Right. So this is Martin Ferguson Smith. Oh, wow. Moreover, to do as Heraclitus does and declare that all things are fire and that nothing in the aggregate of things has reality except fire strikes me as harebrained lunacy. For he uses the senses as a base for an attack on the senses, and in doing so undermines the foundation of all our beliefs and the source of his own knowledge of the fire that he champions.
That is a hugely important phrase.
Yes, yeah. And so I like that because in the Daniel Brown, because he uses the plural in one place and the singular in the other, contradicts his senses by his sense. Someone might be tempted to think the second use means reason, but it's not. He's contradicting his senses with his senses. Well, and then you can't get anything but confusion out of that.
Some people might say that that's evidence of the senses being unreliable.
Yeah.
They're using the senses to claim that the senses are unreliable. That's the same kind of self-contradictory assertion that you have to be able to step back and realize, hey, this is not going to work, to have this self-contradictory assertion. If you've got some authority, Mr. Skeptic, by which you can prove to me that there's something more reliable than the senses, then I will step back and accept your authority, Mr. Skeptic. But I don't know who you are. I don't really even like you. I don't like your nihilism. I don't like anything about you, and I'm not going to listen to you because I have my senses. My senses tell me that the world exists, and I am not going to just accept your attempt to confuse me into thinking that, well, I can't trust my senses because I just can't.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm finished. Go ahead.
I was going to say, this is not to say that we can't use our senses to refine our senses, right? I'm nearsighted.
Right.
I can't see very well. So if I put on my glasses, I can see very well, and I can see the leaves and the trees and things that I couldn't see before. I can get a more accurate, detailed sensory information. And if I had cataracts, to see colors clearly, I would have to get those removed. But how do I know that I need to do that? It's also by using my senses. So the senses are always the gold standard. And I've had conversations with people recently on an atheist or agnostic site that say, well, no, you can trust instruments, but not your senses. And I'm like, well, how do you read the instruments? Do you not ever use your eyes or your fingers or your ears? Or how is ultimately that information being transmitted to you? And how did you decide in the beginning that the instrument was accurate?
That's a new one.
Yeah, your senses had to be involved. They think that instruments can give you, in quotes, objective information. I'm like, nope, you're perceiving this output of the instrument with your senses. It's not getting to you like through the ether.
Yeah, telepathically through logic.
Right. You have to use your senses.
That reminds me of one of, I think, DeWitt's strong points, his strongest arguments, when he analyzes the phrase, all sensations are true. The word true has different meanings to it, and you have to unpack that because every sensation is not going to be as accurate as another sensation. They need to be analyzed to determine the conditions under which they're received. They have to be accepted at face value, but when you realize that the sensation is going to changes as the conditions change, then you have to evaluate using new sensations what the old sensations have said and decide which is going to be more consistent with future reality.
Well, even further, if I'm seeing a color through a lens with a cataract in it, which makes the color muted, more yellow, then that is the color of the light that's hitting my retina through the lens. It's not wrong. That's what it is. If my retinal cells are disrupted, my color sensors, so that they're not working correctly, my brain is perceiving what my retinal cells are, what's going on with them. So it's not that it's not reality, it's that there's a different color that we can see when the lens is clear.
It's a calculation of what is the normal color, because if you're in the eye doctor's office and you're being shown a series of slides and that's going to be the reality for the rest of your life, then you may as well conclude that purple or whatever is the color.
That's the color that you're going to see. So is it a color through a clear lens or a color through a cloudy lens?
Right.
You're subjectively perceiving that. And so a lot of times what we call right is what's typical for a typically functioning human body. But it's never not happening. It is happening.
But this is where people go and try to say that reason and logic are superior to the senses, because they're trying to say that there's something out there called logic or reason that exists in the air by itself, and that is your standard by which you're correcting your sight.
Yeah.
But that's not the case.
That's
You're
not the
correcting
case.
your sight by new observations, by
New
new
observations,
perceptions
yeah.
of the same sense, of the same sight.
Yeah. And in some cases, you're learning where your body may be atypical from most other humans, so that maybe you can't tell green apart from red, and they can.
I think
I
think the Stallings translation can shed some light on this. It's the same one about fire that we read earlier.
Okay.
His argument then takes up arms against them, and so shakes the very bedrock of belief. For how does he perceive that fire of his? By trusting those same senses that deceive.
That is good. Yeah.
Yes. Go on. The next line says, this line of reasoning strikes me as lunatic and queer. Goodness.
Yeah, we can collect the words that they
words,
use,
yeah.
Dotage, I remember seeing somewhere here in sheer dotage. Yes, Monroe says that it is sheer dotage, and then Bailey says it is raving frenzy.
Yep. And
For
Stallings
on
goes on to say, for what will be our reference point? To what can we appeal? Yes. Yep. So this next line, again, why should anyone rather abolish all things and choose to live the single nature of heat? Okay, it seems to be equal madness to affirm either this or that. So there he's saying, well, all right, so why'd you pick heat? Why not earth? Why not air? Why not water? What's your basis for choosing this one thing? That's a good point. That reminds me of the non-supernaturalist, the atheist argument. Well, why are you atheist about all these other gods? Why did you pick this god?
Yeah.
So I find it quite smart to identify then about 3,000 years ago, air, water, and earth as elements. Of course, we know they are not elements today, but still to conclude those, to consider those as elements makes sense. But fire just doesn't make sense. It's nonsense. And the other thing is, in modern textbooks who refer to this, they try to save, so to say, this by identifying these four elements, or classical for instance, elements, as aggregation states. So whereby fire corresponds then to plasma. But I think this is really hiding the fact that they really thought of them as elements, and I rather still see it as an early theory on how to put up the elements. It just fire doesn't make sense because fire. The other three are basically compounds, in some sense.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
But fire is just a phenomenon which comes with a chemical reaction. So that means it's not even a compound.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, you're right. So fire makes the least sense out of all of those, because you could say solid, liquid, and gas, as states of matter, and you could talk about things being compressed or spread out, or but you can't do that with fire. Good point.
Reminds me a bit of Kananda, the Indian philosopher from around the same time as Thales. But he talked about like earth, water, light, and air, as well as some other things as being atoms, but he never mentioned fire.
Yeah, light is better than fire. It's still weird, but it's better than fire.
Yeah.
They strangely err and wander wide from the truth.
Okay, so then this last section, he goes to, any kind of scheme that existed at that time where there was one single type of fundamental construction of everything. So either fire or water or earth or air, and it could change into everything, is obviously impossible for the same reason that the fire can't turn into everything. So today, this is what I was thinking about. We have all sort of different kind of beliefs that there is, the consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality, which has no form. So that physical objects are an illusion, or that physical objects are real, but they're created by consciousness, out of consciousness. Have you heard people talking about stuff like that?
Yeah, I recently saw a headline that even the universe has a consciousness.
Yeah, but not even just that it has a consciousness, but the consciousness is the fundamental, that everything is emerging from that. So this same argument works against that. How are you getting something out of something that has no form? How are you getting form out of something without form? So somebody who enjoys that kind of paradoxical feeling is going to say, well, that right there, that's paradoxical. So that's true. And they stop there. So, and the problems with that are multiple. People, if you believe that, then you can believe that, as some people I know think, that we're each creating reality simultaneously from consciousness. So, like, say, Cassius, you don't exist in reality. I'm creating you with my mind. Right? So if you do that, you can never actually meet another person. You can only talk to yourself. But fundamentally, they have no explanation for how that could come about. How can something which has no form turn into form? They just stop with, well, there you go. There's your paradox. So it's true.
I've heard a very similar argument, but only when it applies to people you haven't met in person.
Oh my gosh. So once you meet them, they're like Schrodinger's cat or something. They've come to life. Wow, interesting.
They're not real until they're directly observed when this condition has been met, whether that's opening the box or both of you driving to some restaurant and seeing each other.
Oh.
Charles, I was expecting you to have a comment on what Elaine was saying. The whole issue of people maintaining that consciousness is the primary aspect of reality and that everything is generated by consciousness, I mean, that appears in a lot of different forms, doesn't it?
That's a very old line of thinking.
Are there some obvious examples of philosophies or religions to take that position? Because it seems to be behind an awful lot of things.
And the whole category is called spiritual monism, right?
Yeah. Maybe not spiritual, maybe more ontological monism. The earliest school I can think of would be Hermeticism, which has seen modern revivals in works like the early 20th century Kybalion. And one of their first principles is saying that the all is mind. I found the whole book to be nonsense, but some people live and die and swear by that book. That book was written in the early 1900s, but Hermeticism goes back to definitely pre-Christian.
Was it around during Epicurus' time?
Before.
Okay.
It was the root of Gnosticism.
Okay. Right.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. I mean, you've got immaterialism, that the immaterial generated the material, that the void generated the particles.
Let's see, it says that here that it emerged in parallel with early Christianity.
Is that Gnosticism or what?
Hermeticism. And so it emerged in parallel with early Christianity, Gnosticism. So it was a little bit after Epicurus.
Well, that's your dualism, I guess, too. Isn't mind versus matter, spirit versus body, all this?
Yeah, but they were non-dualists because they thought everything really was this mind. Yeah, matter could be a property of mind. It's almost like it's an optional thing, but it's not in itself. It's not an actual thing. And I don't know what you can say about that other than it's like, well, where are you getting your information? If you're not using your senses, how am I supposed to know that that's true?
I suggest you could say about that it is sheer dotage, that it is raving lunacy, that it is widely straying from the truth. Those kind of things.
And the off your head.
Off your head. Love it. And the modern science put down is not even wrong.
Yes.
You haven't even said anything that we can even examine, so it's not even wrong.
That's a phrase you see a lot, like you say, modern. It's kind of trendy. I sense that at root it has a very good root to it, though. That
yes.
It's taking a position that there is a reality of some kind.
Yes. Oh, it absolutely is. I feel like Epicurus would love that phrase.
I think so, too. Because it is a phrase that sort of deals in a logical analysis. It is taking a logical position that there is a standard of right and wrong, which would be the opposite of skepticism, I guess, radical skepticism.
Yeah. Oh, I don't even want to say logical. That gets into abstractions. It's taking a position of an evidentiary position that, don't even talk to me about it. Show me. If you can't show me, if I can't examine it, you're not even wrong. You're beneath my time. I don't even have time for that. It's just imaginary.
It's taking the position that right and wrong must be based on evidence, and that right and wrong are not just arbitrarily assertable.
Right.
Without
That's what
evidence.
I mean. It's not based on logic, right? It's not based on reason. It's based on
Well,
evidence.
that's the issue, Elaine, of true reason, I think, versus reason, or maybe there's a such thing as true logic versus logic. I mean, if you're using logic or reason without connecting it to evidence of reality, then you're out of court to begin with. But if you are using logic and reason connected to evidentiary reality, then I guess that's true reason.
Yeah.
Vera ratio, I think, is used regularly in Lucretius.
Yeah.
I mean, this is agreeable if we want to talk about reality. If we just stay within something like, say, mathematics, reality doesn't matter. So, and then mathematics, is essentially just logic. And so in that sense, so if we go look wider than just we want to talk about reality, then some special things like mathematics count as well.
Right. I think math is a special language for sure, but you couldn't just sit down with math and figure out the nature of reality. You would have to look at something.
An old friend of mine he was obsessed with the idea that nothing is knowable without math.
Oh my goodness.
And he tried mathematically proving that hedonism statistically leads to pain over time. And it wasn't even based on like the treadmill.
Well, if it led to pain over time, then it wouldn't be wise decisions about pleasure. So if he's ultimately trying to look for pleasure, then he's a hedonist. I mean,
it made no sense because the initial premise was that using just pure conjecture and mathematics to decisions and outcomes that are very firmly grounded in reality, he couldn't bridge them together, is my point.
Yeah.
Okay, this has been one of our better discussions again, and really interesting topics today. We probably need to bring to a close, though, so let's think about closing comments.
Can't think of any aside from, don't be contradictory.
I want to say reality itself is not paradoxical.
Martin?
I have no summary statement.
Okay, anything else for today?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, hearing nothing, we'll be back in another week or so.
All right.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.